Hi, welcome to Movies Moment. Today we are going to explain a movie called Brightwood. Spoilers ahead. Subscribe if you like this and catch us on the next one. Take care.
Jen goes for a run listening to a podcast about preparing for divorce. Her husband, Dan, tries to keep up with her, pleading for some of her time. They've been married so long that grievances have piled up between them. She sprints onto the trail, circling a pond, and Dan finally manages to make her stop. Jen complains about his appearance, but he is baffled. She's changed too. He then points out the beauty of the pond and suggests they take a photo together. Jen agrees and poses with him by the pond. After the photo, Jen prepares to resume her run, puzzled as to why Dan came along. The previous evening, he had gotten drunk at a party, ruining what was meant to be a celebration of her promotion. Her colleagues were shocked by his behavior, especially since he managed to hit on even the elderly accountant. Remembering this, Jen starts running again, with Dan trailing behind. Soon, he loses his rhythm and slows to a walk. While Jen pushes herself hard along the forest path, she notices a hooded man standing with his back to her at the side of the trail. She doesn't pay him much attention and hurries on. Meanwhile, Dan feels a sharp spasm in his head. Jen also hears a high-pitched sound and stops in her tracks. After a moment, everything returns to normal. Dan continues walking and Jen resumes jogging, eventually reaching the starting point of their run, but Dan isn't there. She stops and looks around. Dan, meanwhile, is stumbling through the bushes, breaking into a sluggish jog, and something collides with him. He complains but finds no one around when he looks back. Bewildered, he scans the area. Jen hears strange noises as well. Dan eventually comes across a barrel on the roadside. The water inside is stagnant and full of trash, with a pair of headphones floating on the surface. Headphones just like Jen's. At that moment, Jen appears, insisting she has something strange to show him. Dan runs after her, but quickly runs out of breath. He begs her to stop and listen to his apology. He admits she's right. There are many paths they could take in their marriage. But Jen points to a sign marking their starting point and notes that the trail itself is missing. Dan suggests there might have been two signs, but Jen doesn't recall another one. She starts running again, and Dan tries to keep up, pleading with her to stop because his head hurts. She only speeds up. Eventually, they stop by the sign again. Dan counts that they've gone around the trail 4 times, but Jen insists they've only completed one loop, yet the trail is still gone. Dan searches the nearby bushes, but nothing changes. They begin to realize something is very wrong. Every time they circle the pond, it feels as though they are starting over. Dan proposes they split up and head in different directions. Jen agrees. Before parting, Dan apologizes to his wife. He admits that their long marriage sometimes drives him crazy, but he still loves her deeply. Jen leaves. She soon finds herself at a sign forbidding swimming and looks around. Nothing changes. The same thing happens to Dan. He finds no turnoffs leading back to the city. They both try to reassure themselves, hoping everything will be fine. Unexpectedly, they bump into each other. Jen yells at Dan for scaring her, but he asks her to stay put while he runs off. Confused, Jen complies. She notices flashes near the pond, as if someone is taking photos, but Dan suddenly crashes into her, startling her again. He behaves as if he hasn't seen her in a while and claims he couldn't find the trail. Jen admits she's frightened, and Dan apologizes. The couple returns to the sign forbidding swimming and stares at it in silence. Dan asks if Jen hears ringing in her ears, but she dismisses it as his hangover. He then questions who would want to swim in the dirty, algae-covered pond. Jen agrees, saying she hasn't seen any swimmers either, but then why is the sign there? Jen speculates that the sign might be the reason no one swims there and asks Dan to remove it. He tries to pull it out of the ground, but fails. Then, Jen decides to call someone. As she pulls out her phone, her headphones fall to the ground. However, she quickly realizes there's no signal. Dan also checks his phone, confirming there's no network coverage. They follow the trail, hoping to find reception, but it's futile. Soon, the couple passes by the barrel with the putrid water again, but Jen insists they keep moving. They run and run until suddenly they see a man in a hooded jacket standing with his back to them. Startled, they turn and run in the opposite direction. Once again, they find themselves at the no swimming sign. This time, Jen notices a pair of headphones on the ground. She picks them up and looks at the 2 identical pairs in her hands, confused. Frustrated, she lashes out at Dan, accusing him of orchestrating some elaborate prank to get back at her for being angry with him the previous night. Dan asks how he could possibly have moved the trees around, but Jen refuses to listen, demanding he stop messing with her. Dan then suggests they cut through the forest directly. They trudge through the undergrowth for a long time until Jen grows tired. They should have come across something by now. This isn't an isolated wilderness, but there are no houses, no people, no signs of civilization. Eventually, Dan asks for a break. At that moment, Jen begins hearing the ringing in her ears as well. Dan chuckles, pointing out that she doesn't even have a hangover. Jen suggests they try to remember the highway that runs near the park, but neither of them can determine which direction it's in. Dan attempts to start a conversation, but Jen dismisses it as inappropriate, her mind filled with violent thoughts of stabbing him in the neck. She finds him useless. He snores, doesn't take care of himself, and has bad breath. She can no longer tolerate it. Stunned by her honesty, Dan reminds her that they've been together for so long and everything always feels the same, as though they're stuck in a dream. Jen explains that she just wants to be happy with someone else while he will die alone. Unexpectedly, Dan agrees, calling it fair. They probably won't forgive each other, and once they escape, they'll start the divorce proceedings. Jen suggests Dan move in with his mother, but he refuses, saying his mother adores Jen. Jen assures him that isn't true. His mother has always lied to him. They'll have to send out notifications about their separation. Awkwardly, they press on, with Dan choosing the direction. They run through the forest and find themselves back at the pond. Jen has a meltdown, refusing to accept the reality, repeatedly yelling, "No!" They both take off running and soon find themselves at the sign again. Jen screams in frustration, while Dan begins to laugh, convinced it must be some cruel joke. After some time, they sit on the ground, unable to decide what to do. Suddenly, they hear a man's voice ordering someone to run, but there's no one around. Dan tries to make sense of it, while Jen calmly states that someone must be advising them to run. The couple continues along the trail. They see the hooded man again, but this time he runs off into the forest. They give chase and catch up to him, finding him standing with his back to them. Summoning their courage, they approach, bombarding him with questions, but he doesn't respond or turn around. Jen urges Dan to talk to him, but Dan hesitates. He throws a small rock at the man, but the figure doesn't react. Jen then taps him on the shoulder before quickly retreating behind Dan. Suddenly, another hooded figure runs past them, and the first man finally turns around, shouting at them to run. To their shock, the man looks just like Dan. Blinking in disbelief, Dan turns to Jen, only to see another hooded man behind her. Before he can react, the figure brutally stabs Jen with a sharpened stick. Terrified, Dan flees into the forest. He stumbles back onto the trail, seemingly colliding with someone, and hears his own voice angrily complaining about nearly being knocked over. Dan quickens his pace, haunted by flashes of his bloodied, screaming wife. Finally, Dan finds himself back at the pond. He's lost, unable to figure out what to do next, when he suddenly hears a scream from the woods, urging him to run. At that moment, he stumbles upon Jen. He tells her to stay there and runs off, ignoring her shouts after him. Dan retreats to a tree, where he vomits. After composing himself, he returns to Jen, unable to understand how she could still be alive. Eventually, he suggests they head in a different direction, and the puzzled woman follows him. They walk for a long time, only to arrive once more at the familiar no swimming sign. Dan wonders aloud who would swim in such a filthy pond. Jen counters that people might if the sign weren't there, and she picks up a tangled mess of headphones from the ground. However, her own headphones remain securely in her pocket. Dan notices that this Jen's shoulders are sunburned and suggests calling someone, but there's still no signal. Frustrated, he walks off down the path, with Jen trailing behind him. As they walk through the woods, Dan suddenly turns to Jen, promising not to lose her and assuring her that they'll make it out. Jen, bewildered, doesn't understand what he's talking about. Dan insists that once they escape, they'll start appreciating each other again. Out of nowhere, another Dan appears, striking the first Dan on the head with a stick and running off to vomit nearby. This new Dan angrily complains that Jen never told him how terrible his hair looked. Jen, utterly confused, complies when he asks her to remove the sweatshirt from his double. As she does so, she accuses this Dan of being clueless about the fact that she comes from a different time loop. Jen puts on the sweatshirt of the second Dan, confidently asserting that they're all the same person. Meanwhile, the injured Dan regains consciousness. The second Dan, in a surreal twist, starts beating himself. Jen, unable to take it anymore, kills the first Dan with a tree branch. Echoes of their argument about the party and the scream urging them to run reach their ears. This version of the couple tries to gather themselves, grappling with the bizarre situation when they spot other versions of themselves on the trail. Dan is horrified by his appearance, having seen himself from the outside, but Jen silences him, pointing out that the other pair hasn't yet realized they're caught in multiple time loops. Dan proposes following the other versions, but Jen protests, begging him never to leave her again. They shouldn't split up. She believes this version of Dan is good, but what if an evil version appears? He joins her, musing about clones, suggesting that if time loops exist, then so must different versions of themselves. Maybe somewhere they're happy, but Jen is convinced they're stuck in hell together. Hearing the word hell, Dan considers the possibility that they might have actually died, hit by a car or mauled by a bear. At least that would explain things. Jen cuts him off, asking him to stop talking because she's exhausted. She hypothesizes instead that aliens may have crashed nearby, and they, as usual, were unlucky enough to be caught in the epicenter. Just then, they hear voices, another pair of Dan and Jen arguing. Jen notes that she looks good, while Dan remarks that they look cute when they fight. The other versions of themselves run off in different directions, and Jen speculates that this might all be some kind of lesson. If they learn it, they might be able to fix everything. Dan, however, believes only the best versions of themselves will escape. At that moment, yet another Dan emerges, only to be killed in front of them. Unable to bear the sight, the couple leaves. Jen asks Dan to catch some food, but he reminds her that they haven't seen a single animal. They wander the forest for what feels like an eternity until they stumble upon a trail. Jen suddenly wonders aloud what she would do here alone. Dan interprets this as a sign she's reconsidering the divorce. Jen reminds him that she's already killed him once, so he should probably keep quiet. Just then, another scream from the woods demands they run. They keep walking. Suddenly, Jen has a breakdown, panicking at the thought of dying here. Dan tries to comfort her, even as she insults him in despair. She's losing her mind, unable to distinguish good from bad anymore. In an attempt to calm her, Dan kisses her, and they both realize that despite everything, they still love each other. Dan apologizes for all his mistakes, and Jen does the same. Then Jen spots a makeshift tent in the woods. The couple cautiously approaches and finds a tangled mass of headphones and Dan's phone inside, along with the badly decomposed body of one of his versions. They both realize there's no escape. They'll never get out. Faced with this grim truth, they confess their love for one another. At that moment, a hooded figure emerges from the woods and swiftly kills this version of Dan. Jen tries to flee but trips over the remains of one of her doubles. She runs to the lake, encountering doppelgangers of herself and Dan along the way. She wades into the water and swims to the other side of the pond. Once ashore, she rests on a large boulder, but then she notices a silver sphere in the bushes. While staring at her reflection, she is killed by another version of herself, dressed in a filthy hoodie. Later, this hoodie-clad Jen drags her prize, her latest double, back to her camp, where yet another version of Dan is eating raw meat from one of their duplicates. It's clear that one version of the couple figured out they needed food and turned to cannibalism to survive this endless purgatory. The story is clearly a metaphor for marriage. Two people trapped in an endless cycle of trying and failing to change one another, venting years of pent-up bitterness and disappointment. Only when faced with dire circumstances do they learn to rely on each other and accept their partner's flaws.